The city breathed its nightly sigh, a long exhalation of rain-slicked asphalt and distant sirens, but inside Ophelia's, the air was held captive. It was thick, perfumed with old money, seared steak, and the faint, metallic tang of unspoken fear. Cassie Vance moved through this gilded swamp with the weary grace of a survivor, her tray an extension of her arm, her practiced smile a shield against the clientele. They were not merely diners, they were men with hollow eyes and women with laughter sharp enough to draw blood, all orbiting a single, unacknowledged sun. She knew the rules by heart: be efficient, be invisible, and never, ever make eye contact with the man in the corner booth. That booth was more a throne than a piece of furniture, upholstered in deep burgundy leather that seemed to absorb the low light. It was where Julian Blackwood held his quiet court. He was a study in controlled power, a man whose silence was louder than any shouted command. His suits were dark and impeccably tailored, a second skin for a predator who had long since graduated from the need to bare his teeth. His presence was a subtle pressure change, a drop in barometric reading that every soul in the room instinctively felt and adjusted their behavior to accommodate. Conversations were pitched lower, laughter was measured, and the clink of cutlery seemed more deliberate. Cassie felt his gaze like a physical weight sometimes, a cool, assessing touch on the nape of her neck as she poured wine or recited the evening specials. She refused to acknowledge it, focusing instead on the delicate script of her order pad, on the number of steps to the kitchen, on the ever-mounting total of her sister Evelyn's medical bills that flickered behind her eyes like a desperate prayer. Her world was a small, desperate circle, the cramped apartment that smelled of cheap soup and medicine, the hushed, beeping silence of the hospital ward, and the oppressive, false elegance of Ophelia's. This job was the fragile thread holding it all together. Every tip she slipped into the pocket of her black apron was a day's reprieve for Evelyn. The fear that coiled in her stomach when she worked was a price she paid without complaint. She navigated the dining room as if it were a minefield, her movements economical, her expression a carefully neutral mask. She was a ghost in her own life, and she preferred it that way. To be seen here was to be targeted. To be noticed was a danger she could not afford. Tonight, the tension was a notch higher. Julian was not alone. Liam Hayes, his right hand, sat with him, the two of them speaking in tones too low to carry. Liam was different, his eyes held a flicker of something that resembled conscience, and he was the only one who ever offered her a nod that bordered on polite. But he was still one of them, his loyalty to Blackwood an unbreakable chain. Cassie kept her distance, serving a table of boisterous financiers whose confidence seemed to shrink the closer they were to the corner booth. She was clearing a dessert plate, her body turned away from the epicenter of power, when the main door opened, and a new kind of silence fell. This one was sharp, immediate, and laced with anticipation. Leo, a man with a brash voice and ambitions that outstripped his sense, swaggered in, his own small entourage trailing him like pilot fish. He was new money and new menace, and he hadn't yet learned the proper way to fear Julian Blackwood. His gaze, bold and sweeping, landed on Cassie, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. The air in her lungs turned to ice. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her blood, that the fragile equilibrium of her night was about to shatter. The new arrival, Leo, was a discordant note in Ophelia's carefully composed symphony of subdued power. His voice, too loud and brash, cut through the low murmur of the dining room like a cleaver. He carried an aura of manufactured importance, a man who believed his own burgeoning notoriety was a shield. Cassie felt the weight of his attention as a physical pressure, a stark and unpleasant contrast to the distant, analytical gaze she was accustomed to from the corner booth. She immediately dropped her eyes, hoping the simple act of not looking would make her invisible, but the hope was as fragile as a soap bubble. She could feel his stare tracing the line of her spine as she moved towards the service station, a predator singling out the most vulnerable-looking creature in the herd. From his throne of burgundy leather, Julian Blackwood did not visibly react. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, the ice cubes clinking softly in the profound quiet that had descended. His eyes, however, narrowed just a fraction, the way a chess master's might when an opponent makes a foolish, aggressive opening move. He watched, not Leo directly, but the reflection of the scene in the polished silver of a nearby coffee pot. He saw the man swagger, the way his companions positioned themselves like cheap bodyguards, and most importantly, He saw the subtle stiffening of Cassie's shoulders, the almost imperceptible tremor in her hand as she placed a clean glass on her tray. She was afraid. This was a new flavor of fear, different from the ambient, respectful dread that usually surrounded him. This was sharp, immediate, and personal. Leo, emboldened by the silence he mistook for respect, settled at a table directly in Cassie's path. When she attempted to navigate a wide berth around him, his voice lashed out, syrupy with false charm. "Hey now, don't run off. A pretty thing like you should never be in a hurry." Cassie froze, her grip tightening on the tray. She forced her face into a neutral mask, turning to face him. "Can I get you something, sir?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Leo leaned back, his eyes roving over her with open appraisal. "How about a smile for starters? This is a classy place, right? Let's see some of that class." The request was a violation, a small, cruel power play meant to assert his dominance not just over her, but over the entire ecosystem of the restaurant. He was marking his territory. It was this moment that sealed the unspoken contract in the room. Julian's gaze shifted from the reflection to the reality. He saw the way Cassie's jaw tightened, the way a flicker of pure panic danced in her eyes before being ruthlessly suppressed. She was trapped, a doe caught between two predators, and her instinct was to freeze. Leo's grin widened, taking her silence as acquiescence. "Come on, sweetheart. It's just a smile. Don't make me ask twice." The threat was veiled but palpable. The other diners had become statues, their meals forgotten, their entire beings focused on the unfolding drama. They all knew the rules, and Leo was shattering them with a sledgehammer. This was no longer about a waitress. This was about a challenge to a sovereign's authority. A faint, almost imperceptible sigh escaped Julian's lips. He placed his whiskey glass down on the table with a quiet, definitive click. The sound was a period at the end of a sentence. He didn't look at Liam, didn't need to. This was a matter he would handle personally. He rose, not with a sudden movement, but with a slow, uncoiling grace that was more terrifying than any sudden violence. Every eye in the room followed his progress as he crossed the floor, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He was a storm cloud gathering, a shadow falling across Leo's table. The air grew thick, charged with a terrifying energy, and the only thing louder than the pounding of Cassie's heart was the absolute, deathly silence that Julian Blackwood carried with him like a crown. The world shrank to the space between the table and the service station, a distance that now felt like an unbridgeable chasm. Cassie's breath hitched in her throat, trapped by the invisible walls of Leo's leering expectation and the sudden, glacial presence approaching from behind. She could smell him before she saw him, a faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and cold night air that cut through the aromas of food and wine. It was the scent of absolute authority. A tremor, starting deep within her core, threatened to travel to her hands, to her knees. She locked her muscles, becoming a statue of fear and defiance, her gaze fixed on a smudge on the wall just beyond Leo's shoulder, a tiny, insignificant flaw in the room's perfection that she clung to as an anchor. Then, a touch. It was not rough, not demanding, but its intimacy was more violating than a shove. Julian Blackwood's hand settled on the small of her back, his palm warm even through the fabric of her dress. The contact was a brand, a claim staked with terrifying gentleness. He stood so close she could feel the heat of his body, a solid wall of power at her back, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Leo's smug grin faltered, crumbling at the edges as he looked up and found himself staring into a gaze as flat and merciless as a shard of obsidian. Julian didn't even glance at the other man, his entire focus was on Cassie, his head tilted down, his lips perilously close to her ear. His voice, when it came, was a soft, resonant murmur meant for her alone, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. "Smile for me, not for him." The words were not a request, not even a command in the traditional sense. They were a fundamental restructuring of her reality. They carved the world into two halves, him and everyone else. She was his to command, his to possess, and her expressions, her very emotions, were now his exclusive property. The order was a cage being built around her soul in that very instant. A sob of terror and a scream of rebellion warred within her, but both were silenced by the sheer, overwhelming force of his will. Slowly, mechanically, as if her body were no longer her own to control, her head turned. Her eyes, wide and shimmering with unshed tears, lifted to meet his. The world fell away, Leo, the frozen diners, the entire restaurant dissolved into a blur. There was only his face, all sharp angles and ruthless lines, and his eyes, which held not warmth, but a dark, possessive fire that promised both salvation and damnation. Her lips, dry and numb, parted. She felt the muscles in her cheeks tighten, a traitorous, spastic MO. The following day bled into existence with a strange, flat quality, the morning sun feeling like an imposter in the sky. Cassie moved through her small apartment in a haze, the ghost of Julian Blackwood's touch still burning on her back, the echo of his command ringing in her ears. The mundane acts of making coffee and dressing for her shift at Ophelia's felt like performing a play, the script written for a person who no longer existed. The fear had mutated overnight, shifting from a sharp, immediate terror to a low, thrumming dread that had taken up residence deep in her gut. It was the fear of the unknown, of the debt she had unwillingly incurred, and of the terrifying attention of a man who treated people as possessions. She considered not going to work, but the thought was a fleeting fantasy. The rent was due, and Evelyn's new medication, a recent and costly upgrade, needed to be refilled. Her life was a house of cards, and Julian Blackwood was a hurricane waiting just offshore. The walk to Ophelia's was longer than ever, each step a march toward an uncertain fate. The restaurant, usually a place of contained tension, now felt like the epicenter of her personal earthquake. The other staff members glanced at her with a new, wary curiosity, quickly looking away when she met their eyes. She was no longer just Cassie, the quiet, reliable waitress. She was the girl Julian Blackwood had claimed. She tied her apron with trembling fingers, the simple knot feeling like a noose. The entire shift was an exercise in heightened awareness. Every time the door opened, her heart leaped into her throat. She jumped at the clatter of a dropped pan from the kitchen. She was an exposed nerve, raw and vibrating with anticipation for the other shoe to drop. It dropped precisely 15 minutes after her shift ended. She was in the back alley, fumbling in her bag for her keys, the cool evening air a relief on her flushed skin, when a calm voice spoke from the shadows near the dumpster. Cassandra Vance. It wasn't a question. Liam Hayes stepped into the dim glow of the security light, his hands tucked into the pockets of his dark coat. He looked, as always, composed and unthreatening, but his presence there was a threat in itself. "Mr. Blackwood requests the pleasure of your company for a private dinner," he stated, his tone neutral, almost polite. The formality of the words was a grotesque parody of a normal invitation. A cold wave of nausea washed over her. I can't. Thank him, but I have plans," she managed to stammer, the lie brittle and transparent. Liam's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something akin to pity crossed his features before being schooled back into neutrality. "I understand," he said, his voice dropping a fraction. "But Mr. Blackwood was very specific. He also asked me to remind you that he is aware of your sister's situation. The myelofibrosis is a terrible burden for a young woman to carry. He mentioned that a specialist from Zurich, a Dr. Richter, is a personal acquaintance. He believes he could make all of that disappear for you." The words were delivered softly, but they hit with the force of a physical blow. He knew. He knew about Evelyn, about the specific disease, about the mountain of debt. He had not just been watching her, he had been dissecting her life, finding every single point of vulnerability. The last vestiges of her resistance crumbled. What was her pride, her fear, weighed against Evelyn's life? This wasn't an invitation, it was a summons wrapped in the velvet of a benevolent offer. To refuse was to sentence her sister. Trapped, with the walls of her gilded cage now visibly closing in, she could only nod, a stiff, jerky motion. "All right," she whispered, the word tasting of ash. Liam gave a curt nod in return and gestured toward a sleek, black town car idling at the mouth of the alley, its windows tinted to a perfect, impenetrable black. The short ride was a silent journey into the belly of the beast. The dinner, when it occurred in a private, soundproofed room above a club she'd never known existed, was a surreal pantomime of normalcy. Julian was there, charming and attentive, discussing art and wine as if he hadn't fundamentally shattered her world the night before. But beneath the surface of his civility, his eyes never lost their possessive gleam, making it chillingly clear that his interest was not a passing fancy, but a permanent, inescapable fact of her existence. He was not courting her, he was cataloging his newest, most intriguing acquisition. Vehement that had nothing to do with joy or politeness. It was a surrender. A small, tremulous, and heartbreakingly fragile smile touched her lips, a ghost of an expression offered as a tribute to a dark god. It was enough. A flicker of something, satisfaction, triumph, passed through Julian's eyes, so fast she might have imagined it. Only then did he deign to acknowledge Leo. His gaze shifted, and the temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. His voice, still quiet, now carried the cutting edge of a scalpel. "She doesn't smile for trash." The finality in his tone was absolute. He didn't raise his hand, didn't raise his voice. He simply gave a single, almost imperceptible nod toward Liam, who was already moving. In a fluid, efficient motion, Liam and another man were at Leo's side, their presence a silent, irresistible force. There were no shouts, no struggle. Leo, his face pale with the dawning understanding of his catastrophic error, was simply escorted from his chair and out of the restaurant, his brief reign of terror over before it had truly begun. The implication of what would happen next hung in the air, unspoken but understood by all. The silence that remained was heavier, thicker, now laden with the knowledge of precisely what Julian Blackwood was capable of, and what price he was willing to extract for a smile that belonged to him. The transformation of her life began with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. It was not a violent upheaval, but a systematic rewriting of her reality, as if Julian Blackwood were an editor meticulously correcting the flawed manuscript of her existence. The first change arrived in the form of a phone call from Evelyn's hospital administrator, his voice dripping with a newfound, unctuous respect. He informed her, with bewildering cheer, that an anonymous benefactor had not only settled the entirety of her sister's outstanding balance but had also established a permanent fund, covering all future treatments, experimental therapies, and even the private room with a city view. The crushing weight of medical debt, a constant companion for years, simply vanished, leaving behind a dizzying, guilt-ridden void. She felt not relief, but the ominous click of a lock. Gifts followed, each one a masterclass in psychological warfare. They were never gaudy or overtly romantic, but terrifyingly thoughtful. A first-edition collection of poetry by her favorite, obscure poet appeared on her doorstep. A cashmere wrap, the exact shade of deep emerald she had once admired in a store window, was delivered in a plain box. There were no notes, no demands for gratitude. Their arrival was a silent reminder that his gaze was perpetual, his knowledge of her intimate. He wasn't buying her affection, he was demonstrating the utter futility of having secrets from him. She tried to refuse them, to return the packages, but the delivery men would only shake their heads, their faces blank, stating they had strict instructions not to take anything back. The gifts accumulated in her small apartment, beautiful, expensive ghosts that crowded her out of her own space. His presence became the new constant in her life. He no longer waited for her at Ophelia's. He began to appear at her apartment, letting himself in with a key she never knew he had. She would return from a grocery run to find him seated in her worn armchair, looking as natural and commanding as a king on his throne, reading a book he'd plucked from her shelf. He would ask about her day, his tone conversational, but his eyes would miss nothing, the way her hand shook as she put the milk away, the tired shadows under her eyes. He started dictating her schedule, his suggestions carrying the weight of commands. "The Italian place on Elm Street has acceptable seafood. I'll have a car for you at 8. To refuse was to see a flicker of cold displeasure in his eyes, a silent promise of consequences she was too afraid to explore. Her free will was being systematically dismantled, replaced with a paralyzing dependency. The cage, she realized with a sinking horror, was not made of threats, but of favors. The bars were forged from Evelyn's improving color, from the specialist's hopeful reports, from the simple, profound peace of knowing her sister was safe. How could she rage against the man who had given her that? How could she fight him when his weapons were health and security? Every attempt to assert a boundary, to carve out a sliver of her former self, felt like an act of profound ingratitude. She was drowning in his calculated benevolence, each act of kindness another brick in the wall surrounding her. She was living in a gilded prison, a beautifully appointed trap where the warden held the key not only to the door, but to her very conscience. The fear had not lessened, it had simply changed its form, morphing from a sharp terror of physical harm into a slow, creeping dread of losing herself completely, of becoming a perfectly cared-for ornament in the curated collection of Julian Blackwood. The shift was as subtle and as dangerous as a crack forming in a sheet of ice over a deep lake. It began one evening when Julian, instead of commanding her presence at a restaurant, arrived at her apartment with a bottle of wine and a quiet intensity that felt different from his usual controlled dominance. He didn't speak for a long time, simply standing at her window, looking down at the city lights as if they were stars in an inverted firmament he owned. Cassie hovered near the kitchen, unsure of her role, expecting a demand, a critique, another silent lesson in her powerlessness. But when he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of its commanding edge, replaced by a low, reflective timbre that seemed to draw the very light from the room. He began to speak of a boy, not a man. A boy who had grown up in the cold, echoing spaces of a mansion where love was a transaction and weakness was a death sentence. He didn't offer names or specific tragedies, only impressions painted in shades of gray and crimson, the scent of his mother's perfume mingling with the acrid smell of fear, the sound of his father's voice dissecting his every flaw, the lesson, learned young and well, that mercy was a flaw exploited by enemies. He spoke of a winter where he'd been left to fend for himself for a week as a test of survival, of the hollow ache in his belly that had been a better teacher than any school. They carved the softness out of me, he said, his gaze still fixed on the distant lights, his profile sharp and unforgiving in the dimness. What was left was only what was necessary. What was hard. This was not an apology. It was a justification, a carefully curated glimpse into the forge where Julian Blackwood had been hammered into existence. Cassie listened, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, a part of her screaming that this was just another form of manipulation, a calculated play for the empathy he knew was her weakness. Yet, against the fortress of her better judgment, a small, treacherous breach was formed. She saw, for a fleeting moment, not the untouchable crime lord, but the lonely, hardened child who had learned that to feel was to be vulnerable, and to be vulnerable was to die. The brutal calculus of his world began to make a horrifying kind of sense. He turned from the window then, his eyes finding hers in the shadows. The raw, unguarded moment was gone, replaced by the familiar intensity, but something new simmered beneath the surface, a recognition. "You are not like the others, Cassandra," he stated, his voice soft but absolute. "They see the power, the money, the fear. They either want to use it or flee from it. You see the man. You are the only one who has ever looked at me and not seen a monster." The statement was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, placing upon her a burden she never asked for. He was anointing her as his redeemer, his sole witness. He was offering her a role in his narrative, a role far more dangerous than that of a captive, the keeper of his hidden humanity. That night, as he left, the silence in her apartment was different. It was no longer just filled with dread, but with a chaotic, unwelcome storm of conflicting emotions. The image of the brutalized boy now lived in her mind alongside the image of the ruthless man. The empathy she felt was a poison, weakening her resolve, blurring the stark line between victim and accomplice. He was no longer just her captor, he was becoming a complex, wounded human being whose darkness had a history, a reason. And in understanding that reason, in feeling that unwelcome stab of pity for the devil, she felt the first, terrifying strands of a connection that felt more binding than any lock or key. The cage was no longer just around her life, it was closing in around her heart. The fragile, twisted intimacy that had begun to coil around Cassie and Julian was shattered by the abrupt and jarring appearance of the outside world. Detective Marcus Thorne was a man built of different stuff than the shadows that populated her new life. He was solid, persistent, and smelled of cheap coffee and stale station house air. He intercepted her on a rare, solitary walk to the market, flashing his badge with a practiced ease that did little to mask the keen intelligence in his eyes. "Miss Vance? A moment of your time," he asked, his voice a low, insistent rumble. He didn't wait for an answer, falling into step beside her, his presence a stark reminder of the normal, lawful world she had been forcibly removed from. He spoke plainly, without Julian's dangerous elegance or Liam's polite menace. He laid out his case like a mechanic diagnosing a faulty engine. He knew what Julian Blackwood was, he knew the bodies buried in concrete and the lives ruined for profit. He believed Cassie was now close to the center of the web, a unique asset. "He's taken an interest in you, a specific one," Thorne said, his gaze scanning her face for tells. "That makes you vulnerable, but it also gives you access. You see things. You hear things. A name, a place, a time. That's all we would need. He offered her the classic deal: witness protection, a new start, a chance to save herself and, by extension, her sister, from a different kind of danger. It was a lifeline, thrown from the deck of a ship she thought had sailed without her. For a glorious, heart-stopping moment, she pictured it, a small house somewhere sunny, Evelyn healthy and laughing, the constant, suffocating pressure of Julian's presence just a fading nightmare. But the hope was a delicate crystal glass, and it shattered against the hard reality of her fear. To even consider Thorne's offer was to play with live wires. Julian's network was a sprawling, sentient entity, his eyes were everywhere. Liam, who had taken to checking in on her with a frequency that felt more protective than surveillant, had likely already received a report of her conversation with the detective. The thought of Julian discovering her betrayal made her blood run cold. His rage would not be loud, it would be a quiet, absolute thing, an ice age that would extinguish all light and warmth from her world. Thorne's protection felt flimsy, a cardboard shield against a tsunami. Could he really stop a man who made specialists from Zurich appear with a phone call? Yet, the seed had been planted. The detective's words festered in her mind, a quiet countermelody to Julian's possessive declarations. She started noticing things she had previously been too terrified to register: the names of shipping companies Liam muttered into his phone, the way Julian's men always used a specific garage on the west side, the casual mention of a meeting at the waterfront warehouse that was dismissed the moment she entered the room. These fragments were meaningless on their own, but to Detective Thorne, they could be the keys to the kingdom. She was trapped in a paralyzing limbo, a pawn caught between the immovable object of Julian's obsession and the unstoppable force of the law's pursuit. Every smile she forced for Julian now felt like a betrayal of the person she used to be, and every moment she spent considering Thorne's offer felt like a death sentence waiting to be signed. The flicker of resistance was alive, a tiny, guttering flame in the vast, dark dungeon of her existence, but whether it would be her salvation or the spark that burned her world to the ground, she could not tell. The illusion of choice evaporated with the quiet finality of a tomb door sealing shut. Julian knew. He had known, Cassie was certain, before the scent of her treason had even fully bloomed in the air. There was no dramatic confrontation, no slammed doors or raised voices. He simply arrived at her apartment, his presence a glacial front that filled the space and stole the oxygen. He didn't look at her with anger, but with a profound, chilling disappointment that was infinitely worse. In his hand, he held a single sheet of paper. He placed it on her kitchen table, the sound a soft, definitive slap. It was an internal police memo, detailing the immediate and unexplained reassignment of Detective Marcus Thorne to a desk job in a remote, suburban precinct, effective immediately. The reason cited was a restructuring of departmental resources. The message was unmistakable: Julian didn't just operate outside the law, he bent its very institutions to his will with a casual flick of his wrist. "Did you believe he could protect you, Cassandra?" Julian's voice was soft, almost conversational, as he circled her. "Did you think his badge was a shield against me?" He stopped directly in front of her, his gaze pinning her in place. "There is no world where he wins. There is only the world I allow to exist." He then proceeded to dismantle her fleeting hope piece by piece, revealing the depth of his surveillance. He knew the exact time and place of her meeting with Thorne. He recited snippets of their conversation, his voice a flawless, mocking imitation of the detective's earnest tone. He had not been guessing, he had been watching, listening, waiting for her to make the mistake he knew she would. Her attempt at agency, her grasp for freedom, had been nothing more than a predictable move in a game he had already won. The punishment was not directed at her, not physically. That was the true masterpiece of his cruelty. He moved closer, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Your defiance has consequences, but they are not for you to bear. You forced my hand, and now I must make the lesson clear." He explained, in calm, meticulous detail, how Evelyn's newfound medical security was a delicate ecosystem entirely dependent on his continued favor. The specialist from Zurich, the experimental treatments, the private room, all of it was a house of cards. "One word from me," he murmured, his breath ghosting across her cheek, "and it all goes away. Dr. Richter finds his services are no longer required. The funding evaporates. Your sister is returned to the overworked public system, to the waiting lists and the generic drugs. How long do you think she will last then? He was holding Evelyn's life hostage for her good behavior. The ultimatum was delivered not with a shout, but with the quiet certainty of a man stating an unchangeable fact. Complete, unquestioning loyalty. No more secrets, no more thoughts of escape, no more conversations with policemen. She was to be his, fully and completely, in mind, body, and spirit. The alternative was not her own death, but the slow, agonizing death of the one person she loved most in the world. He had found the one price she could not afford to pay. As he left her standing there, shattered and utterly defeated, the walls of her gilded cage were no longer just visible, they had become a crushing, inescapable reality, and she knew, with a certainty that broke something inside her, that she would do anything, become anything, to keep her sister safe. The flicker of resistance was not just extinguished, it had been scorched from the earth, leaving behind only the barren soil of surrender. The silence that followed Julian's ultimatum was not peaceful, it was the pressurized stillness of a vacuum, sucking all hope, all sound, all future from the room. For days, Cassie moved through her life as a specter, performing the motions of existence under the weight of his absolute control. She smiled when he expected a smile, she spoke when a response was required, but inside, a desperate, cornered animal was screaming. The image of Evelyn, vibrant and laughing in the sun-drenched fantasy of witness protection, had been replaced by a far more visceral one, Evelyn, pale and gasping in a crowded public hospital ward, her life seeping away because of Cassie's failure to obey. The choice was no choice at all, it was a slow, spiritual death versus the very real, physical death of her sister. But the human spirit, even when broken, possesses a stubborn, irrational core. It was this core that began to whisper a mad, dangerous plan. Not to win, not to defeat Julian, but simply to run. To vanish. It was a plan born of pure, undiluted desperation, a final, frantic lunge for the fire exit before the building collapsed entirely. She began to hoard cash from the generous allowance Julian provided, stuffing bills into the hollowed-out spine of a book. She secured 2 bus tickets under false names, her hands shaking so badly she could barely type on the library computer. She planned it for a night she knew Julian would be occupied with a high-stakes business meeting, a window of vulnerability so small it was barely a crack. She told herself it was possible, that his reach, while long, was not infinite, that they could disappear into the anonymous sprawl of another country. The escape itself was a blur of heart-pounding terror. She retrieved Evelyn from the care facility under the guise of a special overnight trip, her sister's trusting, excited chatter a knife twisting in her gut. They made it to the grimy bus terminal, a world away from the opulent prisons Julian built. The air smelled of diesel and stale pastries, and for a glorious, fleeting moment, it smelled like freedom. She clutched the tickets in her sweaty palm, her arm wrapped tightly around Evelyn, as the bus rumbled into its bay. This was it. They were going to make it. The doors hissed open. And then, the world froze. Parked with casual menace across the street, were 2 black SUVs, identical to the one that had first taken her to Julian. Leaning against the hood of the lead vehicle, arms crossed, was Liam. His face held no anger, only a profound, weary resignation. He didn't move to stop her, he didn't have to. The message was delivered in his presence alone. The game was over before it had begun. The feeling that washed over her was not surprise, but a deep, soul-crushing certainty. There were no cracks in Julian's kingdom. He had anticipated this final, desperate gambit and had simply waited for her to play it out, to exhaust herself in the futile attempt. The confrontation, when it came, did not take place in the terminal. They were escorted, not with violence but with a chilling courtesy, back to her apartment. Julian was waiting inside, standing in the center of the room as if he had grown from its very foundations. He dismissed a terrified Evelyn to the bedroom with a calm, reassuring nod before turning his attention to Cassie. His rage was not the fire she expected, but the absolute zero of deep space. He was chillingly calm. "You continue to test the limits of my patience, Cassandra," he said, his voice soft as falling snow. "You seem to believe there is an or else. There is not." He closed the distance between them, his gaze holding hers captive. "You are mine. There is no world where you exist without me. You breathe the air I allow you to breathe. You walk the ground I permit you to walk." He laid out the final, brutal terms of her existence. She could accept her place by his side, embrace the dark devotion he offered, and in return, Evelyn would want for nothing. Or, he would walk away. He would withdraw every shred of his support, every doctor, every dollar, and leave Evelyn's fate to the indifferent machinery of chance. The choice was hers, a life of gilded servitude or the certain, slow death of the only person who mattered. He stood before her, not as a lover, not even as a captor anymore, but as a force of nature, and he forced her to speak the words of her own surrender. The surrender was not a single moment, but a slow, deliberate drowning. In the days that followed the shattering of her escape, Cassie felt the last remnants of her old self detach and float away, like ashes on a still pond. The fight was gone, extinguished not by a grand display of violence, but by the chilling, absolute certainty of her predicament. Julian's words echoed in the new silence of her mind, a mantra that had reshaped her reality. There is no world where you exist without me. To resist was not just futile, it was a death sentence for Evelyn. And so, she made her choice. She stopped looking for exits in the gilded patterns of her cage. She stopped flinching from his touch. She began, instead, to study him, to learn the subtle language of his power, not to subvert it, but to navigate it, to find a way to exist within its shadow without being completely obliterated. The transformation was internal, a fundamental recalibration of her soul. The fear did not vanish, but it mutated, merging with a strange, dark acceptance. When Julian presented her with a breathtaking, obsidian black gown for the opening night of the city's most prestigious opera, she did not see it as a costume for a prisoner. She saw it as a uniform for her new role. She allowed the stylists he sent to work on her, their hands turning her into a masterpiece of his creation. As she looked in the mirror, she did not see the frightened waitress from Ophelia's. She saw a woman of impossible elegance and unnerving composure, her eyes holding a depth that had been forged in the crucible of despair and desperate love. She was becoming his equal in the only way that mattered, in the understanding of the dark pact between them. The opera house was a cathedral of wealth and influence, a world Julian owned as thoroughly as he owned the streets. As they ascended the grand staircase, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, a hush fell, not of the fear that filled Ophelia's, but of awe and razor-sharp curiosity. All eyes were on them, on him, and by extension, on her. She felt the weight of their gazes, the whispers that trailed in their wake like a bridal train. She was no longer a secret. She was a statement. He was presenting her to his world, and in doing so, he was making her a part of its immutable fabric. They took their seats in the central box, overlooking the glittering crowd and the waiting stage. The lights dimmed, the overture began, but Cassie was the center of her own performance. She felt Julian's gaze upon her profile throughout the first act, a constant, assessing pressure. During the intermission, as he spoke with a powerful city official, his hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her own. The touch was no longer a brand of ownership, but a signal of unity. She looked down at their joined hands, at his pale, strong fingers laced through hers, and felt a terrifying sense of rightness. This was her path. This was the price and the reward. To save her sister, she had to become this. She had to embrace the darkness he offered and find her own power within it. As the lights flickered for the second act, she turned her head and met his eyes. And this time, when she smiled, it was not a tremulous, surrendered gesture. It was a genuine, chilling curve of her lips, a smile of shared secrets and terrifying understanding. It was a smile that acknowledged the monster and promised to stand by his side. It was for him, and him alone. The final barrier within her crumbled, and the last echo of Cassandra Vance, the waitress, the sister, the fighter, was silenced forever, replaced by the serene and deadly calm of the woman who belonged to Julian Blackwood. Did Cassie's surrender mark the end of her story, or the beginning of a far more dangerous game? To discover more dark tales of obsession, power, and the lines we cross for love, subscribe for future narratives.